G'day. Some things in life are complicated. And when you're dealing with complicated ideas, I find there's two good ways to handle it. First of all is to either boil the idea down into its key concepts and make it into little bullet points, or break it into chunks so you can examine each piece on its own. That's where thought play comes in handy, breaking things apart, separating ideas. And it's kind of ironic that we're talking about breaking things up, because that is related to the topic of today's video, and that is love. Today I want to look at 5 aspects of a relationship. What those aspects are, how we define them, how you can pull them apart and examine them individually, and how you can challenge other assumptions that attach to each of those ideas in order to further pull apart your ideas and separate your little Lego bricks of thought. Now, relationships are messy and complicated at the best of times, especially when they're not going so well. When the relationship is having difficulties, or it's tanking completely, or it's in the process of breaking up, you need to be able to straighten things out in your mind so you can think clearly about things and implement solutions and make good decisions. Because those good decisions may include scary things like difficult or awkward conversations, confrontations, very hard life choices, and even the decision to end the relationship. This can be especially true of toxic or abusive relationships, where you may still have feelings for the person, or you feel like you're in physical danger or harm. Even trying to resolve simple domestic issues in an otherwise working relationship can sometimes be difficult and create anxiety and anger. I've found that thought play is particularly useful for navigating this prickly, sticky landscape. Unlike the moon landing conspiracy video that I did last time, where I pulled apart thoughts, reassembled them back together and put them on a base of logic, today I just want to concentrate on pulling components apart for the purposes of being able to examine each of those individual components and making better decisions in relation to each of them. Because in most cases, we have this innate understanding of a relationship as a whole, of all its dynamics together. And that can make differentiating the different aspects and finding root causes quite difficult sometimes. I'm not particularly surprised about these correlative parts, because when Dabrowski was describing an individual and the maturation of their personality through the 5 levels of positive disintegration, he also described multi-dimensions. So each aspect of you as a human, your intellect, your emotions, your creativity, these aspects may develop at a different rate. So rather than your whole person just going through the 5 levels of positive disintegration and your personality developing, some aspects of yourself, or those dimensions, can develop at different times. If this multi-dimensional thinking can apply to an individual, it means that it can also apply to a relationship. And the different components that I'm going to go through can have different levels of development, or in the case of a relationship, of good health. But before we go examining what state of health those components might be in, we need to put definitions around those different dimensions, and we need to understand exactly what they are. So for me, I've identified 5 different components of a relationship. I'm going to use dictionary definitions to outline some of the differences between those components and why I think they're separate. And then I'm going to challenge some further assumptions that we have about relationships based on the fact that I've now separated those components. So the 5 dimensions of a relationship that I've identified, or I think are separate, are love and emotions, the interpersonal relationship, the domestic partnership, the sex life, and the individual self within that relationship. Using the dictionary, I've now been able to define those terms and highlight the differences between each aspect or dimension of the relationship. In the case of love, it's defined as an intense feeling of deep affection or connection. So this is all about the way that you feel about each other. for an interpersonal relationship. It talks about the way in which two or more people are connected and interact. So we're talking about the actual mechanics of the interaction and the way the two people define how they are interrelated to each other. In the case of a partnership, so in a domestic partnership, it's a commitment or formal agreement to an ongoing relationship or shared goal. Your sex life is your sexual attraction and activities, and self is a person's essential being that distinguishes them from others. So using those dictionary definitions, that is my 5 facets of a relationship. So now what I want to do is challenge some of the other assumptions that are attached to each of those 5 components. In the case of love, there's often an assumption that your relationship is good as long as you two love each other. You know the old saying, all you need is love. Well, relationships and love being 2 separate things, you can love each other and have a relationship that is in really bad shape. So I'd like to challenge that assumption first of all. There's also the assumption that you can't love more than one person at once, and therefore any affection or love that you show to other people must be met with jealousy. Love being simply an affection, it can be given to another person, it can be given to members of your family. In fact, you can feel love for the whole of humanity. Even your fur babies get your love. If you're able to have love for the entirety of humanity, why is saying the L word such a big deal in a relationship? And I'll challenge you to think about who in your life you actually express your love to. What about the relationship, the way you interact and define your relationship? I'd like to challenge the assumption that a relationship has a predetermined definition, that there's some rules in society of how your relationship is supposed to function, what you're supposed to do, what constitutes romance and a healthy relationship. As far as I'm concerned, as long as you two are happy in the way you interact with each other, it doesn't matter what society thinks. And I think Dabrowski would be all for that notion of challenging those socialized assumptions about what is and isn't allowable or acceptable in the definitions of your relationship. There's also that assumption that you can't love someone in an abusive or toxic relationship. And I'll challenge that, because if those things were so simple, it'd be much easier for people that are in toxic relationships to walk away. But quite often what keeps people there is the fact that they still love the person. But by separating love and relationship and looking at the health of your relationship, it can help you determine whether or not it is actually a good thing for you to stay. And there's also the third assumption that a relationship is supposed to be hard work. Again, that's just something that society is defining by default, that you have to put hard work in. Yes, you do need to put in effort, but if a relationship's going well, it's much like a job that you really love. It doesn't seem like work at all. But what about a domestic partnership? Well, it seems to me that there's a lot of arguments that come from living with another person. The first one I'd like to challenge is that there is no agreement in a domestic living situation. And whether you've written down rules formally or not, I think the fact that you share a roof does sort of offer some sort of an agreement. And when you share a house with a person, it should be an unwritten rule that both of you will take on some sort of responsibility for the day-to-day domestic chores. Now, I know there's been a lot of stuff all over the internet about gender roles and domestic work. And as far as I'm concerned, I think you could challenge the notion that any domestic stuff should be split by any gender roles. The only thing for me that applies is that the workload is divided fairly. You both live under the roof, you're both responsible for it. There's also an assumption that arguments over a domestic life are a sign of a bad relationship. I don't necessarily think that's the case. If the relationship is defined as the interaction between you, the fact that you're arguing over socks left on the floor doesn't necessarily mean that your relationship is tanking. It just means that you haven't learned to cohabitate yet. And the third assumption that I'd like to challenge is that compromise in a domestic situation denotes a loss of self. Just because you have to agree on what to watch on the television together doesn't mean that you're losing your self-identity. Compromise in a house is a perfectly normal thing, whether or not you're in a relationship. If you were sharing a house with your housemates, you'd be expected to compromise. You'd be expected to pitch in and clean, and you'd be expected to split areas, time, sharing stuff. That's what house share is all about. So, separating the ideas surrounding domestic partnership and relationship and love can actually be quite helpful. If it comes down to it, you can get very scientific about your partnership and write down your rules formally if it helps. What about your sex life? So, between consenting adults, what you do behind closed doors is your business. But I'd like to challenge some assumptions that you might hold over your own sex life. First one is that you can't have sex without love, and that sex outside the relationship is a cause for jealousy. There are people out there who choose to extend their sexual relationships with other people outside their intimate relationship, and they are proponents of that lifestyle, and they seem to be getting along quite well in it. So there is food for thought there for anyone who is considering that if someone proposes that you have sex outside your relationship, that it's necessarily a cause for jealousy, or that the person doesn't love you anymore. Maybe that's particularly adventurous. There's also an assumption that a failing sex life is a sign of a bad relationship. A failing sex life could be a sign of anything, down to someone's poor health. Maybe it's just the fact that someone needs to go to the doctor and not that they stopped loving you. And there's also the assumption that there is an ideal sex life you should aspire to in a relationship. There's any number of bits of advice in women's magazines that tends to hold some sort of norm or ideal amount of sex, or what you do in the bedroom as something that you should aspire to. Now, if the two of you are happy, then I would not be listening to anyone's advice. Again, Dabrowski would support that. Screw society's ideals. If it works for you, then it's right for you. And the last component I want to look at the assumptions around is self, because you as an individual are still an important component within your relationship. The first one I want to challenge is that you must sacrifice self for the greater good of a relationship. Again, I don't think that a relationship should be hard work. Your goals and your sense of identity aren't necessarily there to be at the cost of a relationship. You do not have to trade in who you are for the greater good. There's also an assumption that time apart is a sign that the relationship is failing, rather than it being taking time apart to work on yourself, to invest in your own likes, interests, and feelings. And the third assumption is that strong sense of self is not important and a healthy part of a relationship. Now, anyone has been in a power dynamic in a relationship that's not healthy or is toxic will know that maintaining your strong sense of self, maintaining your boundaries is actually beneficial to help keeping a relationship on track. So, there's a whole bunch of assumptions about a relationship that you can challenge and pull apart, as well as the 5 components that I think exist that you can also pull apart and examine on their own. Now, what do I think constitutes a healthy relationship? Well, as far as I can tell, there's only one real factor, and that is that both of you are happy. As Dabrowski would say, screw convention, screw romantic stereotypes, and screw what society thinks. And as much as Dabrowski would encourage you as an individual to find your authentic sense of self, I'm sure he would also encourage you, between the two of you, to find what is your authentic relationship. If it's non-conventional, if there's no white picket fence and 2 kids and a mortgage, if you do things a little differently, do not despair, because as long as the two of you are happy and you are living your authentic relationship selves and living your lives happy, don't worry what anyone else thinks. Now, if you're not happy in your relationship, the one piece of advice I would give you is this, and I've learnt this the hard way. Even if you love a person, if your other bricks are broken, your relationship is not in good health. And believe me when I say love is a very powerful thing, and it has a habit of persisting even where we wish it wouldn't. Even after a relationship is dead and buried, heartache and grief will persist. There is a good chance that you will still feel love even for people who have treated you poorly. But you cannot let those feelings distract you from the fact that the rest of the bricks are broken. However, if someone does stay in your heart, even after the relationship is long gone, don't see it as a bad thing. Try this little bit of thought Lego. See it as a sign that you have the capacity and capability of loving human beings even under the most strenuous and difficult of circumstances. And if that's the case, I can guarantee you that there is a chance that you will love again. But I'm no expert. I'm just one person with OE, sharing my ideas in order to spread some happiness and maybe just a little bit of love. See you later.